Okay, well, welcome everybody to Solar Noon Tuesday. I'm Jay Warmke with solarpvtraining.com. And if you're new to this format, what we're going to do is we're going to go through, we try and do this every week at noon Eastern Time in the US. And we're trying to recap what's happening in the world of solar. So we do a dive into, in 10 minutes or less, what news events are happening within the world of solar. Then we touch on what webinars are available, what upcoming conferences are happening, and then we go into a deep dive about things of interest to those of us who are interested in solar. And we're joined at this moment live with people from really all over the world and on Zoom. And so hopefully we'll get some interaction there. So let me go ahead and dive into what's happening in the world of solar for the week that begins January 4th. So the US grid is currently flooded with data center proposals that will never get built, according to a recent white paper by Schneider Electric. The paper argues that only 10 to 20% of all proposed data centers will ever get beyond the permitting stage. If true, the report argues, this may lessen the projected impact on load demand growth, but it also makes it more difficult for utilities and grid operators to plan for the future. Now, last year, Rand Corporation's upper confidence forecast projected 347 gigawatts of AI sector power consumption by 2030. But Schneider Electric called that prediction extreme and is citing a more modest forecast of just under 100 gigawatts of additional power required. And such claims like this echo a 2018 Lawrence Berkeley National Labs study that compared load forecasts with the actual growth in 12 Western US utilities in the mid 2000s and found that most overestimated future demand. Data center developers are adept at playing utilities off against each other to manufacture price elasticity, according to a former commissioner from the Texas Public Utilities Commission. The phantom load problems arise because the cost of getting into the queue is lower than the weighted likelihood that you will not use your position. So part of this is that currently there's like PJM, which is the oversight here in the Midwest where I'm located. There's a 5-year wait before they'll evaluate your application for load demand added to the queue at these levels. So get your name in there, whether you're going to use it or not. And as long as it's cheaper, this report went on to say, to buy a queue position and not use it than it is to not have it, well, then you'll buy these queue positions all day long. Many utilities are trying to raise the cost of these low demand applications. This year, Dominion Energy, Appalachian Power, and Rappahannock Electric Co-op proposed new large load rate classes that would apply to data centers. They would require the data centers to pay at least 60 to 80% of the contracted demand costs, even if the data center is never built. Capacity prices in the PJM Interconnection's latest auction hit $329.17 per megawatt day. That's the price cap across that region. That's up 22% from a year ago. PJM expects to increase to lead to a 1.5% to 5% bill increase for most ratepayers. That's just for that particular auction. PJM is the regional transmission authority that manages the grids across states located between New York and Chicago. Now, the situation might have been even worse. Analysts estimated that without the price cap that was established in an agreement with Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, the capacity price for the 26-27 delivery year would have been nearly $389 per megawatt day, which is 18% higher than it turned out to be, which would have been a price increase of about 40%. In 2024, PJM's capacity auction sent shockwaves through its 13-state region when prices rose tenfold, up from $28.92 per megawatt hour day to $269. And now we're saying that it would have been up to $389. A capacity price is the cost utilities have to pay generators for the promise that power will be available in the future. It's not the cost of the power itself. The auction's high capacity prices are signs that the market believes that future demand will be far greater than future supply. Residential electric price rose more rapidly than commercial and industrial prices from 2019 through 2024. Now, according to a study released last week by Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, nationwide, average residential prices jumped 27% during that 5-year period, while average commercial and industrial prices increased 19%. Now, electric bills have increased a further 13% in 2025, according to a separate recent report. So that's a 40% jump over the last 6 years. Researchers also found electric prices charged by investor-owned utilities are higher and have risen faster than those charged by public power utilities. However, IOU inflation-adjusted spending on distribution and transmission increased, while the cost of generation actually declined during that period. The report placed much of the blame on increased prices on customers who are opting to install their own solar generation. They claim states with larger price increases in recent years typically featured shrinking customer loads, particularly linked to the growth of net metered behind the meter solar, and had renewable portfolio standard programs in concert with relatively costly new renewable energy supplies. Now, to me, that sounds a bit like blame the victim. But anyway, a report by Bank of America last week completely disagreed with those conclusions and said, nope, it's really because there's growing demand for electricity generation, and there have been increased grid investments by the utility companies, as well as higher natural gas prices that appear to be the dominant reason for rising electricity prices. The Ohio Northern University Institute for Civics and Public Policy recently compiled its annual poll with a special focus on the public opinion around zoning issues, which included the development of solar farms. This was conducted in October, and they actually surveyed about 1,600 and some Ohio adults. In general, the poll found that solar farms are quite popular amongst Ohioans, with clear majority expressing support for solar development. Over 55% said they're in favor of solar farms, with only 19% opposing them. So a good percentage didn't care one way or the other. Of the 55% who support solar farms, 25% strongly support them, 30% somewhat in support. Of the respondents who opposed them, only 8% were strongly opposed. Overall support was lower in rural areas, which you would imagine, but it was still 18% positive over negative. Well, when you get into the suburban and the urban areas, in urban areas it's 53% positive versus negative. Ohioans responded favorably about economics of solar farms. They also thought they were good for the environment. Now, across every measured category, they felt that they had a positive view of solar farms. The data strongly supported solar farms overall, with a positive of about 36%. The only consistent trend here was that those people who were against it viewed themselves politically as strongly conservative. And a new report released by Reimagine Appalachia found that 67% of the region's 92,000 plus clean energy jobs, which amounts to about 61,000 jobs, are now at risk following a dramatic policy shifts under the Trump administration. The recent report documents how clean energy investments across Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, and Kentucky have flatlined after recent dramatic growth. According to the report, clean energy investments had tripled from 2021 to 2024, peaked at $4.7 billion in the third quarter of 2024, but have now stagnated, with private corporation expenditures plummeting from $1.27 billion in the third quarter of 2024 to just over $440 million right now in the third quarter of 2025. Their claim in the report, the Inflation Reduction Act had brought unprecedented investment and job creation to communities across the region. They documented $9.85 billion in private energy investments over that period, 18.8 billion in clean energy manufacturing, and 22.3 billion in purchases of clean energy technologies over the 5-year period. They were transforming the communities, creating good paying jobs, and now that is falling away. And I think that's the news. Yep, that's the news from the solar industry for this week. Does anybody have anything they would like to add to that before we jump into the events of the week? Anything that's crossed your desk over the holiday season? All right. Keep jumping, but just jump in if you feel it. As I mentioned, there are not very many events or webinars. Everybody sort of slows down for the holidays. We've got a couple of conferences coming up. There's the Clean Fuels Conference in Orlando, Florida from January 19th through the 22nd, and PowerGen in San Antonio, the 20th through the 22nd. And that will give me an opportunity to plug shamelessly our online courses as well as our face-to-face at solarpvtraining.com. And if you're interested, or if you do solar curriculums, you can, in schools or technical schools, we've got a lot of information there about textbooks and labs for your classrooms. So that's, I'm done with my commercial. Anyway, so that's the events. As I said, I didn't run across any new webinars that were coming up. So anybody who has something on their agenda, I keep throwing it out there for you, but I'll give you one more option here before I jump into our deep dive here. All right, I don't see anybody. Keep looking over there. All right, so what I thought I would do, and I think this has become sort of an annual tradition here. I found that over the last couple of years, what I try and do with the first session of the new year when we're back at this is to do a real quick recap about what has happened within the world of solar over the past year. What are the big events? And then try and make a few predictions about what I think is going to happen in 2026. And so that's what we're going to do here. And I'm hoping that you guys will have opinions and feel free to jump in and tell me I'm full of it or I'm exactly right. So I'll give you a hint as to which one I prefer, but anyway. All right, and we should mention also that these sessions are you can get a half-hour credit, 30 minutes credit, if you're certified in solar with ETA, the Electronic Technicians Association International. So you can go into solarpvtraining.com, and there's under the tab that says Solar Noon Tuesday, and just click on there. And after you've looked at the session, the recorded session, it will generate a certificate for you. So that's kind of the best way. Or you can join in on our YouTube channel, but you're not going to get a certificate that way. All right, so let's look back when I had a haircut a year ago and see what happened in 2024. So I thought as a recap there, you'll see that when we were recapping last year, when we reviewed 2 years ago, solar installations had grown, manufacturing capacity within the US had grown, prices continued to fall. The installations had shifted to the east, away from California, and storage was the big word. And I would say a lot of what happened in 2025 were extensions of that. But what were the predictions? What did we predict for 2025? And basically, we predicted that installations, even though they had been growing pretty dramatically, felt like they were probably going to flatten out. At the moment, we hadn't really known what the policies of the Trump administration would be, but it wasn't hard to predict that they were going to be kind of anti-renewables. It turned out, I think it was a little worse than what we anticipated, but it wasn't that solar was going to fall off. It was going to flatten. And some of the reasons for that was lack of labor. We just simply don't have that many people or enough people to see the industry grow. as dramatically as it had in the past. For instance, interconnection delays, we're seeing, as I mentioned earlier, PJM, where we have a 5-year delay before they'll even look at your application for adding load to the grid. Uncertain policies, of course, that was for sure. Didn't know what tariffs were going to be. Didn't I personally didn't imagine that they would go in and revoke the Inflation Reduction Act because I really, felt like it would be difficult to get a veto proof or a filibuster proof majority within the Senate. Didn't really anticipate they'd add it to a budget bill where they decided they didn't need that majority in the Senate. High interest rates were an issue there, of course. That was going to retard some of the development and supply chain constraints. Those were some of the reasons for the fall off in or the leveling out of anticipated additions of solar to the grid. And so when we look at to see what happened, in fact, it was pretty close. It was down slightly. Now, in 2024, there was about 50 gigawatts of capacity within solar added to the grid. And now in 2025, we are looking at just under that, somewhere in that range. Now, what the experts at CEA are projecting is that it's going to fall off. It's going to fall off fairly dramatically, 20% over the next year. I'm not sure what their rationale is there because I disagree with it, but this is what they're projecting. Instead of it just leveling off, they're seeing it fall off a bit. And but as I said, I don't agree. I think that they're underestimating the large installs before the investment tax credits end. There is some confusion there within when exactly they're going to end because we have a bit of confusion about what constitutes safe harboring. When do you qualify, how much of the project you've got to have completed, how much you have to have spent. But at least 2026 is going to be within that realm of safety. If you start your project in 2026, you're still for commercial and utility scale systems, it's still going to qualify for some of these tax credits. So that's going to, in my mind, accelerate the growth of utility scale and larger projects in 2026 because there's going to be this push, as there was in residential in 2025, to try and get these things underway before they miss out that window when they qualify for the tax credits. I also feel like they're missing measuring and the impact of these large systems that are going to simply be behind the meter. One of the issues that we run into with the whole interconnection debacle that we have here in the US is that currently, let's say I'm Google and I want to install solar at a data center that I'm building, and they are still building these data centers, even though maybe they're overestimating how many they're going to build. It's still pretty dramatic, at least in the short term, how much of this is happening. Well, the regulators treat those as two separate events. If I want load demand, let's say I'm going to add a huge amount of load demand to the grid, they say, okay, that's one thing. We need to evaluate your project based on your load demand. If I, as Google, say, hey, don't worry about the load demand, I'm going to be building solar or wind or my own little nuclear or whatever they pretend to be doing. I'm going to do that to meet that load demand. Well, then the regulators look at that as a separate event too. So they're saying, okay, we have to do a full evaluation based on the load you're adding to the grid. And then we have to do a full evaluation based on the supply that you're adding to the grid. And they don't look at that as a net zero event. They look at it as two very large events that will require separate study and separate evaluation. And, it's a mess. So if I'm one of these large data center developers, it will be very, very attractive to just say, all right, I'm going to forego that expense and that 5-year delay of having you guys figure this stuff out. I'll just build it all behind the meter. I'll just go off grid if I have to, build my own little micro grid and create my supply, create my demand, and do it without you guys. And I think we're going to see a lot of that happening within these larger data centers, within commercial enterprises, within private individuals, private homes, because as the cost of storage comes down and the cost of connecting to the grid goes up, as these utilities and regulators add more and more layers of bureaucracy and cost to it, there becomes a price point where it's actually cheaper to just not connect to the grid. And currently, those systems are not being measured as effectively as we measure those things that are connected to the grid. I think because they pull a lot of their numbers off the applications for these connections. So this may be a bit of a phantom development because it's not being measured cleanly, but I think it's going to be a trend nonetheless. So that's going to be a big issue. So I'm looking at it saying in 2026, I don't see a 20% fall off. I see a 20% growth in solar plus storage within the grid. So that's sort of, I'm getting ahead of myself with my predictions, but I really think 2026, I think we're going to see growth. 2027, yeah, maybe that's when the fall off begins. But short term, I think we're going to see the growth. And I think we are seeing the fall off for residential. Residential is still a pretty minor player when you look at the system overall. You know, when we think about solar, we're probably thinking about putting solar on our home. And so residential is sort of the mindset we're looking at, but it's still pretty small. What is, I'm thinking 10, 15% of the overall solar market. But I think that that's going to fall off dramatically in 2026, largely because all of the investment tax credits fell off December 31st, 2025. So if you didn't get it installed by the end of last year, your prices just went up 30% here in the United States. So that short term, going to see a drop off in residential pretty much nationwide, and except for those states like Illinois has got a good incentive program. Places like that, they may be pockets where there are other incentive programs that make it valuable. But then my prediction is, well, I'll get to it. All right. So before we get into some of the details of this, I just thought what I would do is a quick recap as to looking back, what were the big things in the solar industry, and kind of none of them had to do with the solar industry per se. They were really a lot of changes within governmental policies that affected solar in a pretty dramatic way. 2025 was perhaps, a decade from now, we're going to look back at it and say, okay, 2025 was a watershed year when the solar industry had to put its big boy pants on and start, functioning without these governmental policies that were designed to buoy it up in its infancy. So maybe we've gotten into adolescence and we're going to be causing all sorts of problems. But so anyway, tariffs was a big issue, not only in solar, but in everything, which leads to the bottom one there, which is general uncertainty. We're seeing a lot of playing around, adding costs to the domestic industry that many countries don't experience because we're paying 50, 100% tariffs on some of these products that are coming in. And that just simply adds costs that otherwise, wouldn't be there. The IRA being repealed was huge. That began the removal of a lot of these incentives that the industry has maybe frankly become too dependent on. When you start saying, okay, I can save 30%, I get it back as a tax credit, great. I personally, I think it was not a misguided policy. If I'm psychoanalyzing the Biden administration, I would say they put a lot more of these incentives in place where they expanded it for nonprofits, they expanded it for governmental, they added credits for manufacturing. because they were saying we're going to see a huge load demand increase. We need to incentivize quickly the development of new generating capacity. And the capacity that we've identified that we want to encourage specifically is wind, solar, and battery. And these policies were effective at doing that. But it artificially deflated the cost of solar and wind and battery installations. It did that purposefully because it wanted to accelerate the development. Well, that went away. The Trump administration has come in and said, nope, I don't like that. We do not want to encourage wind and solar and battery. Well, they're not so bad about battery. They kind of are agnostic, I think, about battery. Wind and solar for sure they don't like. And we would like to subsidize or try and invigorate natural gas, coal, and nuclear. Well, problem is that's not going to work. Natural gas, it's simply elevating the cost of natural gas. So when you incentivize demand for natural gas, you raise the price for the existing supply, which counteracts any of the incentives. So the cost compared with wind and solar doesn't change, or in fact maybe gets worse. Coal is a dead industry anyway, so you can incentivize it all you want. It's not going to be able to compete. And nuclear is just stupid. I mean, nuclear is 5 times as expensive as the alternatives. So go ahead. The timelines, well, I've ranted on that before. But anyway, so what they've effectively done is they've said we want to disincentivize or take away the incentives for wind and solar, and we're not doing anything effectively to replace it. So that's going to cause some load demand issues. The higher interest rates, that was an issue. Hopefully, we're beginning to see those coming down, but it's going to happen slowly. So those higher interest rates have led to decreased or increased costs of any form of generation. So that will, of course, be passed on in higher rates. California, the Utility Commission of California completely messed up their net metering process. They basically reduced net metering compensation by 70%. They killed a very vibrant residential solar industry within California, and doesn't really affect the rest of the nation, but California was such a significant part, it affects the overall numbers. So what we've seen is this moving of growth to other states away from California as their incentive program has been diminished pretty dramatically. And so all of these things, all these policy changes just simply created a world of uncertainty. So people were hesitant to install systems. Developers were hesitant to move forward. There were supply chain issues. So that was sort of the general malaise that hit the market in 2025. But as you can see, we still saw that the growth of solar didn't change very much. I mean, we saw it even, basically stay even from the year before. So even against all these headwinds, solar and storage, and those kind of go in tandem, did very well. So I don't want to paint a negative picture of that. All right, I'll take a break or take a breath here and see if anybody has any comments as we're just on that as we're getting into this. Give you guys a
Yeah,
sec.
Jay. Pursuant to your logic for the 20% growth for 2026, I think some of that, correct me if I'm wrong, you're predicating that on the acceleration of certain thinking and the lag of other factors. Do you see it diving then in 2027 if you're right about 2026?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I would think that there's going to be a fall off. There's going to be a natural fall off because most of the growth of solar has been in the utility scale. And at some point, you're going to reach a saturation. Now whether that's going to be 2027, 2028, 2035, I don't know when we're going to be. A lot of it depends on how much load growth we're going to have. But most of the growth of wind and solar over the last decade or so has been as fossil fuel plants were being retired. So it was a replacement kind of growth where the overall generation within the grid didn't change that much, but we replaced coal with wind and solar as it was being retired. Now we're seeing some load growth through artificial intelligence, through electric vehicles, through the electrification of industrial systems and heating. So all of these things are projecting now to have a significant load growth over the next 3 to 5 years. So I think there's still going to be a demand for this over the next 3 to 5 years. But the question is, will the demand and supply, how quickly can we keep up with it? I think we're going to be in for some short-term turmoil with rising prices, with power outages, with things like that. Eventually, we're going to get it all sorted, but I think there's going to be some short-term turmoil versus long-term. Long-term, it's all good, but I do feel like we tend to overshoot and undershoot, and these systems take a while to plan. So as you're saying, the demand is going to be there, but will the suppliers line up? I think they're going to try and get in under the deadlines for the incentives, and then they're going to say, okay, then let's reevaluate. But reevaluating means a year or two where they'll be underbuilding. So yeah, if I had to project, I'd say next year is going to be really good at the utility scale, and then probably 2027 is going to drop off fairly significant. Bill, you had a comment there?
Yes, I was wondering what the impact is going to be of the Foreign Interests of Concern Act, where imports from China will be dropped to zero. I'm also concerned about and the other consideration is the fact that the leased systems are going to be able to continue until 2027. So we've got another year of lease system potential.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the foreign impact issue is going to be huge from a supply chain um, issue. If for those who aren't familiar, there was the law that was part of that was in the big beautiful bill, wasn't it? As part of all of that nonsense,
Yes,
where
I
they're
think so.
yeah, they're basically saying that if you buy any component from the identified bad people, China, Russia, what was it, Iran, North Korea, I don't know if there was anyone else in there, but some of the interpretation of that was like if I bought something that had a bolt that was manufactured in China, I would I wouldn't qualify for any of these. And I think were there punishments as well, or just you didn't qualify for the incentives? Um, do you know, Bill?
No, I don't. I just thought that maybe there would be a lack of supply from
Yeah.
those countries. I think they included Malaysia, Vietnam, and Cambodia. A number of other countries were added to the list.
Yeah, I don't know if that, I know that has in the tariffs they did because they said they're just Chinese panels passing through. But yeah, either way, it's going to really, really mess with our supply chain. So I think that's another reason why 2027 we may see a dramatic fall off within the utility scale. And I don't know about residential because we're not really getting any incentives there anymore anyway. I think the major incentive for residential solar is going to be the rising cost of electricity. So if your electricity bill goes up 20%, well, then the cost of solar just went down 20% as far as the payback. So that's I think we're in that phase. But I guess if I had to make a prediction, that's what this is all about. I would say the next 3 years are going to be very tumultuous. It's going to be a mess, not just in solar, but like in everything. But so we're going to be part of that, and I think people are going to be hunkering down, and maybe solar will be the beneficiary of that, because if the systems we rely on are beginning to fail, well, then you begin to develop systems on your own if you can afford it. So so that's going to be a big deal.
Well, given the political winds that blow, possibly accurate to say the only thing we're certain of is that there will be a sun in the sky in 2 or 3 years.
Yeah. Yep. And let's harvest some of that energy. So it sounds like you were going to break into a song from Annie, right? The sun will come up tomorrow. All right, so let's let's talk a little bit about the retiring of plants. This was something we brought up at the beginning of the year. I think my prediction was that they were going to be retired at the rate that they were anticipating. That's proven not to be 100% the case, but pretty close. When we look at how many were planned on being retired in 2025, we're looking at 12.3 gigawatts of capacity. And as you can see, most of these are coal power plants, some natural gas and petroleum, really no wind or solar. Wind or solar is pretty new technology. And one of the reasons for the retirement of these plants is they're getting really long in the tooth. I visited a local coal power plant a couple of years ago, and oh my gosh, it felt unsafe to be in that building because literally they had taped off with police tape sections because the roof was leaking and things were falling off of the walls, and all of the dials were analog, and it looked like, Dr. No was going to come out of a room somewhere and tell us that the Soviet Union was about to attack. It really was a mess. So they're retiring these things because they're really falling apart and they're too expensive to operate. They just are way too expensive compared to the alternatives. So 12.3 gigawatts were scheduled to be retired. But what the Trump administration has said is don't retire them. We're promoting fossil fuels. We're promoting coal. We're promoting natural gas. So we don't want you to close them. And they're literally ordering the utilities to keep them open. Well, that creates a whole new set of problems because the reason these guys want to retire them is they cost more to operate than the revenue they generate. So if you're ordering a utility to operate at a loss, somebody's going to have to pay for that. So that will just simply be one more factor that will lead to the increased cost of electricity. Now, 12 point something was going to be retired, only 8.7. So still 75% of it or so was retired. And I think we'll see that happening. This is a policy. This is all purely political. It's saying don't retire at sea. We kept these things open. Yeah, but you cost $100 billion, doing it. So at what price? So that's a big issue. Yep. Pete, you have a comment?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but is that not from the party of let the market decide?
Yeah, yeah. Don't pick winners and losers. Don't be putting your thumb on the scale. Of course, I always like to say if hypocrisy were oil, America would be OPEC. So that's what we export. We export hypocrisy. All right. So solar manufacturing. This is another big thing that the politicians like to talk about. I It doesn't work. I mean, we're trying to incentivize manufacturing. We're doing it with a two-prong approach, carrot and stick. There have been the incentives for locating your plants here in the United States. The IRA put a lot of incentives there for putting manufacturing here domestically. And then there are sticks, which are the tariffs. Okay, if you're importing the product, we're going to charge you 100% tariff, 50% tariff, whatever it is. If you make it here, we're going to give you some incentives. The reality is Chinese companies just decided to open up robotically operated plants here in the United States. So I don't know what you're really accomplishing there. But I've contended for a good long while that the United States will never outcompete China for producing products at a low cost. And we're also now trying to compete against them in a technology that's on its way out. Silicon-based solar, it's still going to be around for a good long while, but there will be a technology that replaces it. And I personally feel like perovskite is a good technology that has the potential of replacing it. So if we don't really have a strong silicon-based domestic manufacturing base that we're trying to protect. It's not like the American auto industry or something where we have a long established base and we're saying, okay, they are not able to compete internationally, so let's try and, put our thumb on the scale and pick winners and losers. So we're going to focus on that. We don't really have that. So we're trying to protect an aging industry or perhaps an obsolete or first generation industry against people we'll never outcompete for price. And so the only net result is we elevate the cost of solar for people who live in the United States. I flippantly like to say that if the Chinese government wants to subsidize the cost of me installing solar on my roof, I'm willing to let them. I'm happy for them to pay part of the cost of my installation. And then as a policy, we should be looking at the next generation, the perovskites, and dominate that. But that's not going to happen. So we're already seeing that while manufacturing domestically did increase somewhat, the demand just far outstripped it. You can see there from that chart how that works. I mean, it's a losing battle. It's a policy that I just don't think will ever work. All right. So yeah, Bill.
I think I agree with all of your conclusions there. However, I think one of the things that makes it very important for us to do quality control of those imported panels that we have coming in, because we have thinner frames to reduce cost, bigger panels that have bigger wind loading. We have TopCon, which is showing itself to have corrosion problems and encapsulant problems. We have N-type of silicon that is starting to show more rapid degradation than we anticipated. So I think from all three of those standpoints, we need to do quality control, even if we import the panels that we get.
Yeah, I think, yeah, you're right, of course. And of course, that's a separate issue from whether or not it's manufactured here domestically or not, because we can do crappy manufacturing as well. I mean, China can't outcompete us for that. We can do lousy products. So yeah, we need high quality. The solar industry has always sort of embraced this race to the bottom as far as price. So that's maybe a cultural mindset that we have to get past, because if you make things cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, eventually you're going to get cheaper and cheaper products, and that's not good, especially if we're going to continue to say these things are going to last 25 years and you're making them out of tin foil, it's just not going to work. So yeah, we need to perhaps increase our focus on quality, decrease it on price. So I'm agreeing with you there. Okay, so let's look at the solar shifts east. This was another projection, and this was part of us from last year. And then I would just say that this seems to be moving. I guess I would say that solar moves to the Midwest is maybe a better recap of that. If you look at the numbers, if you look in the left-hand column there, 2023, if there's a high number there and a low number in 2025, to me, those are pretty dramatic. Indiana moving from 15th to 3rd. I mean, who would have imagined that Indiana was going to be the 3rd ranked state as far as installations? And Florida, you could guess, but Ohio, 6th. Kentucky moving from 40th to 8th. Illinois, 9th. Arkansas, Michigan. So a lot of this is that these are states that were not part of that initial surge of solar installation. They were not early adopters, but now we're beginning to catch up. And a lot of it you can see is in that PJM territory. So this is the area that's seeing a lot of solar growth, where you can jump on board when you're talking Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania. These are large utility scale systems. for the most part. There's certainly residential for sure, but it is interesting that solar is shifting, and many of these are red states. So it never made any sense to me that this was a red state, blue state issue. That was a manufactured culture war. And now we're starting to see the economics of it moving into these red states. So, but it's still at the utility scale level. So we're seeing, excuse me, where the utilities have always been, I don't like solar, I don't like solar, I kind of like solar. Solar's great, but only if I own it. So that's sort of been the evolution of their thinking on it, and they like it because it's cheap. But they don't want you to own it. They don't want their competitors or their customers to own solar. So they keep putting barriers in place, which keeps making it more attractive not to be connected to the grid. So that's something that's another mega trend that we're going to be looking at. The projected growth of storage, well, this is purely economic. As the cost of batteries goes down, the attractiveness of putting solar or storage onto the grid becomes, more and more of an option. And you can see with this the dramatic growth of storage. And the one big beautiful bill, the anti-IRA legislation that went through this year left storage alone pretty much. So storage, whether it's in tandem with solar or it's in tandem with natural gas or it's in tandem with whatever, the capacities for storage is just going to continue to increase. And you can imagine on a personal level, on a homeowner's level, the attractiveness of solar plus storage goes up and up as we begin to see the grid get less and less reliable. As utilities implement time of day pricing structures, as they start putting in demand charges. So all of these storage issues, it becomes attractive as the utilities change the way that they bill, the cost of storage comes down, and the grid becomes less reliable. Okay, so a recap of some of the predictions from 2025 is that the growth overall of solar would slow. I think we've seen that pretty much right on track. US manufacturing can't compete. Yeah, I think we've seen that as well. Storage grows. That's not a hard prediction. That's going to continue on for probably almost forever. Bidirectional charging will not be a thing. Now, this one is one that I guess I'm a little bit proud about, a little bit smug about, but they've always been talking about bidirectional charging. We've had the predictions of that for 2023, 2022, 2024, 2025. All the industry press each year says bidirectional charging, using your electric vehicle as a battery backup, grid to everything, vehicle to grid, vehicle to home, vehicle to business, vehicle to everything. It just has not. And basically at this time last year, I said, no, you know what? The technology's not there. The standards aren't there. We're still not going to see it. It's still going to be vaporware. And I think that's pretty much proven to be the case. I'm going to change my tune this year, but that was pretty much on track. Now, one of the things that I've always been bullish on is perovskite as a technology. And so far, I've been proven wrong. Every year, I say, this is great. This is going to be the next big thing. And it doesn't really happen. We're starting to see tandem panels coming in where you've got silicon with a little layer of perovskite. So you're getting, it's moving in that direction. I'd say it will continue to be. I'm still bullish on it, but I just don't know whether it's next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Who knows? Silicon seems to have a pretty long shelf life here. And off-grid becomes economical. And I think that's proven to be true. Although just because it's economical, are people widespread adopting it yet? Not so much. Still connecting to the grid is a good option. If the grid is available, it's a good option. I think we're going to see that continue to change, to morph. But but these were some of the predictions. So I said bidirectional would not be a thing in 2025. I think 2026 is going to be the year we start to see some product. We're starting to see maybe generic product out there where the battery from your vehicle becomes backup to your home. I think at the residential level, I just think we're going to start seeing some of the players coming out. If people like Solar Edge and Phase start coming out with true bidirectional charging, it's going to be slow, but it's going to pick up. If battery technology is a thing, if the grid keeps getting less and less reliable, using your EV as battery backup is a really, really attractive option. We just need to have good generic product to select from. So far, all the bidirectional charging product that we've seen has been proprietary. It comes with an EV like the Ford Lightning, where it has its own system. Everything's proprietary. So I think we're going to see that happening. Okay, so let me get into my predictions. I'll do these one at a time and invite comment. So the predictions for 2026, I predict electricity prices in the US will increase on average at least 10%. That's going to be pretty dramatic. And one of the things that I found, which I found very interesting, is if you look at this first chart, this is price increases really from 2000 to about 2025. And just look at the curve. It goes steadily up until you get to, what is that, about 2008 there. And then it flatlines, and then you get to 2020, and it starts to go up pretty dramatically. Now let's look at load demand. Goes up till you get to about 2008, flattens out, and when you get to about 2020, it goes up pretty dramatically. I would say, at least from this chart, it looks like a pretty strong correlation between load demand and price. So as load demand goes up, so do prices. And we're seeing that there will be a dramatic load demand increase over the next few years. So I'll invite comment on that particular prediction before I move on to the next one, which is sort of hinted on the screen there. Anybody have a comment on that, or is this one that everybody is sort of universally in support of?
The EIA has historically been notoriously conservative and usually wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, EIA is and I think you can almost know that any prediction they make about renewables is going to be wrong. It feels like, and it's tempting when you're in a government body like that to say things next year will be pretty much the same as they were this year, only more so. But we know that things change, and sometimes pretty quickly and pretty dramatically. Okay, my second prediction, which I talked about earlier, is that I think solar will grow by about 20% this year in 2026, and residential will fall off pretty dramatically. So the growth is going to be in commercial and utility scale. If I had to bet, if I were a solar installer, I'd be focusing a lot on commercial installs. Residential is still going to be around, especially if the grid proves to be unreliable quicker than we're anticipating. But I think we'll see a growth of solar, but a fall off in residential. Yep. Yeah, go ahead, Pete.
Yes, some 5, 6 years ago, NREL called for proposals on on-site use of solar generated electricity. I'm just wondering if they got any significant proposals, or if some point that will start to prop up residential solar adoption. Because I never heard of what proposals they got. Got to help our business.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that. They were asking for what? Electrical uses within residents?
Yeah, on-site use of solar generated electricity for residences.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of that. I mean, I've mentioned before, there is a real move towards, we've seen, of course, electrification of air conditioning. Air conditioning has been electrical pretty much from the start. But recently, we're seeing a lot of movement away from natural gas as the primary source for heating and towards electrical. We're seeing geothermal, we're seeing mini splits. A lot of that activity is happening, and that's pretty dramatic load increase that's being put in place. We're also seeing at the industrial level a lot of electrification away from natural gas. And a lot of that has been because natural gas has gotten, as a fuel source, pretty volatile and comparatively expensive. So we may see, who knows, it may shift back as electricity gets more expensive and more volatile. But my guess is it's just going to be a contributor to load demand. EVs add load demand. AI centers, data centers add load demand. So it just feels like we're in a perfect storm over the next 3 or 4 years of fairly dramatic increased load demand um, at all levels.
Jay, you
Eh,
had made a point early in your presentation about these data centers having to get into a queue.
yeah.
Is this a national regulatory requirement or is this state by state? I didn't quite understand.
Yeah, it's not really state by state. It's more RTO, Regional Transmission Authority. So PJM is one. The Western, there's MISO, so each one has different policies, but they all do require queues in order to be evaluated and assessed. It just sort of happens that PJM was one of the worst case scenarios, and it's also the place where there's a very large concentration of these new data centers going in. So that's kind of the poster child of where this causes problems. But Texas is another regional transmission authority organization there with ERCOT. And so yeah, it's not state by state, but
It's regional.
it's regional, yeah.
Yeah,
But
okay.
I don't know of any region that's got its act together. So what I've seen from the people, the large data developers, is they're talking about going behind the meter. They're basically saying, listen, I mean, they've got the money to do it. So they're just saying, okay, well, I can put in my own generation facility, I can put in my own load demand. So if you're
Yeah.
going to cause me delays, I just won't connect.
Yeah, and
And
I think for the sake of having a deeper understanding of why the queue is important to the utilities and to the grid systems, these things are so massive that there will usually be even in large commercial installations, the user is going to ask for two trunk lines to come in, which means that that's two substations serving the facility. And I can only imagine that some of these data centers might be looking for three or four trunk lines, which rearranges substation locations and up and down the grid connections.
yeah. And some of these
Okay.
data centers are so huge. I mean, I know there's one in Mississippi or Alabama that's being built size of Manhattan, and some of these will take enough power that would power a fairly large city. So you're talking about scale that is kind of unprecedented. Now, a lot of that might be exaggerated. We did have that thing that only 10 to 20% of these things, according to Schneider Electric, are actually going to be built. But if you take them at their word, this is going to be pretty dramatic. And the way that the system works right now, if you think about, let's say you decide you're going to build a sports stadium and it's going to add 100,000 vehicles to the traffic pattern of your surrounding community. Well, the developers are going to say, the people in charge of the roads would say, oh, you want to do this? Well, you've got to pay for another lane on the highway. And you go, really? I don't know that I could afford that. Maybe that costs you more than the stadium itself. So,
Major,
then there's,
yeah,
pardon?
major switchgear for for any kind of large installation is sometimes 6 months to a year just to get it ordered, pay
Yeah.
for it, and then wait for it to be built and delivered.
Yeah, and they were talking, of course, if the generation is located a distance away from where this consumption is going to take place, then you've got transmission capacity that's a big issue. And I think they said like 10 years ago, we were adding 4,000 miles of high speed, high capacity transmission a year to the grid. And last year it was like 4 miles. So transmission, and you can imagine there's a problem if you're going to put in these big, huge power lines, then you've got to get the right of way, you've got the permitting, you've got the hearings, it's going across state lines. There are different jurisdictions that are involved. So co-locating the power generation at the site where it's going to be consumed has a lot of advantages. And if one of the downsides of trying to put in this data center is that you've got a 3 or 4 or 5 year wait as they're evaluating your plan, there will be it'll be increasingly attractive to just simply not connect to that grid. So that's, I think, going to be a trend we're seeing. And the same is true for your home. All of these things scale. If the utility comes back to you and says it's going to cost you $50,000 to connect to the grid because you're adding load capacity, well, you can put in a lot of solar for $50,000 and just simply not connect to the grid. Okay, so prediction number 3 is I do think, and this is really stepping out on a ledge, that bidirectional charging will come to market in 2026. That will be something we can look back a year from now and you guys can say, I told you so. That was wishful thinking, and Lucy's going to pull away the football as I try and kick it. But I think this is going to be a thing. And I think that solar plus storage will constitute 90% of new additions to the grid in 2026. This goes away against a lot of the conventional thinking. We're hearing a lot about natural gas. It's sort of they're touting this as the next big renaissance for natural gas. We're hearing a lot about small nuclear. This is going to be the answer to data centers. I think that's all nonsense. I think they'll double down on solar plus storage. It just meets all the needs. But you can see if it's 90%, that's up from about 80% this year. We have some natural gas and we have some wind. I would project that wind falls off, because there are such headwinds for the headwinds. I keep using wind analogies, but there's such opposition by the Trump administration about wind. And that's going to be hard to push through. Natural gas, they're touting it, but getting natural gas generators is just simply not something you can do. Certainly not in 2026. There's a 3 to 5 year wait if you ordered a natural gas generator. So unless it was already in the pipeline, I don't think it's going to happen in 2026. So the only option really is going to be solar and battery storage. So as much hype as they put out there about natural gas or nuclear, I think 90% of all of our new capacity is going to be solar and solar plus storage. And I also feel grid prediction number 5 is that we're going to see grid defection accelerating. It'll accelerate at the data center sides. It'll accelerate at the residential sides, residential scale, and also even at the commercial scale. And I put a picture here of the balcony storage or balcony solar. We're seeing some of that. They are just the idea of how can I install solar without having to fight the utility. And as the utility makes it harder and harder for you to install solar on your home or your business, you have an option. Just simply don't use them. Go off grid. And the costs are becoming competitive. So, going independent without the grid is going to be price competitive. So the more price competitive it gets, the more people will opt for it. So those are my 5 big predictions. It looks like we're right at the end of time, which is good for me because you don't have any opportunity to object to all of my projections. So anyway, so I think that takes care of us for this week. And I appreciate your attention, and we'll be back here next week, and we're going to talk a bit about some installs.